Welcome to day 3 of the Sociology Guys A-Level Sociology 2022 challenge. What I do is every day I set 20 marks of questions from the information that is not on the advanced information that's been released by AQA. This is the other things that you could be asked questions on, particularly for the 4, the 6 and the 10 mark questions. I set 20 marks of questions each day, and then what I do is I answer them, and I post it up on my website, and I also record a video walkthrough of sort of like how to answer some of the questions. So let's look at today's questions. Today the focus was on gender and education, and so there are 3 questions here to answer: a 4 marker, a 6 marker and a 10 marker that has an item with it. Remember, with a 10 mark, apply material from the item and analyze question. What you need to do is you need to draw information from the item in your answer, but we'll look at that as we go through it. So the first question was outline and explain 2 ways in which home factors influence gender differences in achievement. So that's 4 marks. Second one, outline and explain 3 ways education helps to shape gender identity. Gender identity is on the specification. So it's something that you may get asked. It's one of those things that you don't always realize that you're learning, but it is there. And then question 3 was an item question. It says, item A, in recent years, girls have been outperforming their male peers at all stages of the education system. This has been explained by sociologists as being due to the changes in the way children are taught and assessed, as well as the increased presence of women in educational roles. And the question here is asking you to apply material from item A, analyse 2 ways in which in-school factors impact on gender differences in educational achievement. So let's look at some of the potential responses we could have put here. So gender and education, just a few things that I sent out earlier on today. Gender socialisation at home. Boys are socialised into being more active, girls are socialised into more passive roles. Literacy rates, the activities that are commonly associated with girls, things like reading and communication, will improve their literacy skills. Furthermore, sort of like boys, they tend to see literacy as belonging to the feminine domain and are less engaged with it. In part because it's usually mothers who will read to them, although that is changing in societies. Lots of initiatives to get boys into literacy. Bedroom culture, girls are excessively controlled, which means they're more likely to spend time indoors, and they will therefore develop their educational skills by doing homework and by doing research on the computer, things like that, whereas boys are more likely to be active, they're more likely to be given a little bit more freedom, and they're more likely to be out of the house in their spare time. And mothers as role models, so the increasing involvement of women in employment leaves girls with higher aspirations. That's another point that sort of like you can make there. Role models is a big one with gender and achievement, because we can see it as working inside and outside of the school. Let's look at my response to this question then. So, one way in which home factors influence gender differences in achievement is through gender socialisation. Girls are socialised into being more passive, which helps them to conform to teachers' ideas of being the ideal pupil, which means teachers will view them positively and help them to achieve. Okay, so what I've done is I've identified a way, gender socialisation, and I've explained it. Something like gender socialisation, this idea that girls are socialised into being the more ideal pupil, it can also link to internal factors, and it's one of the things that we look at when we're teaching this topic area, is that interplay between factors at home and factors in school, and how things from your home life can influence the way you're perceived in school. It's a really useful thing to do when you're analysing and when you're making evaluations at a higher level, is looking at that internal versus external idea. Second way in which home factors influence gender differences in achievement is through literacy skills. Children are more likely to be read to by their mothers, which means boys often associate literacy with the feminine domain and reject it, while girls embrace it as part of their identity. This places them at an advantage when studying subjects with higher levels of literacy, and they achieve higher grades than boys. I could have made that shorter, to be honest with you. I've kind of gone round the houses with that, but I've made sure that I'm going to get the 2 marks for it. I've identified the way, literacy skills, usually based at home. And then I've explained it in the second part, how sort of like boys see reading as being part of the feminine domain, and therefore they're less likely to engage with it in schools. And I've also explained sort of like why girls are more likely to do well in literacy based subjects. Gender identity. Now, gender identity is quite an interesting topic. What we look at in here is the way in which the schools are shaping gender identity. Now this can be through a number of different factors. It doesn't necessarily have to just be the school. It can also be the interactions within schools, particularly the role of peers, developing gendered subcultures that reward conformity to traditional gender roles. So for example, I think Epstein talked about males being rejected by their peer groups if they were seen as being quite good at education. So the idea would be is that boys tend to shy away from showing how good they are in education because they don't want to be mocked by their peers. Likewise, girls tend to reject sport because I think it was Patcher suggested that girls who are involved in sports, particularly in mixed schools, less so in single-sex schools, girls are kind of mocked and seen as being butch or masculine if they are involved in sports. Subject choice is another way in which schools shape gender identity. Each subject tends to belong to a certain gender domain, so maths and sciences tend to be in the more masculine domain, and arts and humanities are seen as being more in the feminine domain. Despite changes that we've seen in society where girls are being more accepted into science and maths, and there are more girls doing science and maths than ever before, we still see the arts and humanities as being part of the feminine domain. And maybe that's something that we need to address in wider society, get more boys involved in the arts and humanities, get them more involved in those subject areas. Teacher expectations of behaviour from different genders. Teachers will have different expectations, so their expectations of girls to behave will be higher than boys. They will almost expect boys to behave badly, and when boys are a little bit more boisterous, they're less likely to be disciplined, and when girls are boisterous, they're more likely to be clamped down on, because teachers have lower expectations of boys' behaviours. And sexual identity, there are double standards for both male and female sexuality. Girls are told not to distract boys, not to wear clothes that might distract boys, not to wear makeup, not to look feminine because it will distract boys, whereas boys are just allowed to be boys. So here's my answer. Outline and explain 3 ways education helps to shape gender identity. One way education helps shape gender identity is through subject choices. Science subjects are seen as being part of the male domain, and this is reinforced through textbooks and more male teachers in science subjects. This confirms to boys that scientific ability is part of their gender identity. It's the idea that sort of like males are supposed to be more logical than females, and females are supposed to be more emotive. Again, it's a bit of a stereotype. We need to challenge those stereotypes in society, but in a 2-mark question, you could quite easily put that as an answer. A second way in which education shapes gender identity is through teachers' expectations of girls' behaviour. Girls are expected to be passive and submissive, and teachers will be more likely to discipline girls for boisterous behaviour than boys, which reinforces expectations for girls to be passive. Okay, so I've identified a way, teachers' expectations of girls' behaviour, and then I've explained it. So that's my 2 marks there. A final way in which education shapes gender identity is through uniform. Boys are expected to conform to masculine clothing such as trousers and shirts, while girls are expected to wear skirts and blouses. This reinforces expectations of how boys and girls should look in wider society. Again, identify a way, explain it. If this was a longer question, you might criticise that and say that some schools now have got more gender neutral policies about uniform and how we can see sort of like the changes that are happening in society. But for a 2-mark question, looking at this idea of how uniform reinforces gender identity is a good response. Now, the next question, we can look at this 2 ways because it asks about gender, and what we're looking at is in-school factors. So not only can you look at factors that say that girls have improved, but also that boys are underachieving in comparison to girls. So I've put up 5 reasons here, and again, this is something I've sent out, and you can download this off my website. Introduction to GCSEs and coursework. This is said to improve the performance of girls in education, as they are seen as being more organised, more thorough in their presentation. However, and a big however here, coursework makes up a very small percentage of a student's final grade, usually no more than 20 or 30%. So girls do still have to perform well in exams. Another evaluation of this could be that since 2015, many subjects have had coursework removed. More female role models in schools. Now this can work 2 ways. Okay, more female role models in schools, so we have more teachers, we have more female teachers, we have more female heads of department, more female heads now than before, and this acts as girls seeing an educated role model, and it gives them higher aspirations. The more females there are in schools, it means there are less males in school, which means there's a lack of male role models, and I'll look at that in a second and how that can have an impact. Okay. Pupil-teacher interactions, girls are seen as being more likely to be the ideal student. We've touched on this in an earlier question. However, we can argue that just because girls are seen as being the ideal pupil doesn't mean they receive more attention. Boys are likely to receive more attention from teachers than girls, although many people would suggest that sort of like it is negative attention rather than positive attention. Another thing that you look at, we wouldn't use it for this question, but in school initiatives and social policies, things like GIST and WISE, we wouldn't necessarily use it in this one because it's not really mentioned in the item, although maybe you could draw a link. I couldn't see an obvious link with it, but things like GIST and WISE will encourage girls to achieve higher. And the feminisation of education, which I think we would very much link into this question. The education system has become feminised, so the changing in way teaching methods work, so more collaborative teaching methods, coursework favour boys over girls, ratio of female to male teachers, that's all part of the wider feminisation of education. However, there are still more male head teachers, more male assistant head teachers, so men do still rise to the top, even though the workforce is very much balanced in favour of women in education. Looking at some of the internal reasons for boys' underachievement, lack of male role models. So this is kind of the alternative view, that if we've got more women in schools, then that means we've got less men, which means boys don't have positive role models. It's good to look at role models as a possible response in here, because you can get some nice analysis in, because what you're doing is you're comparing how one group is advantaged and one group is disadvantaged by there being more females in education. We can criticise this and sort of like say that males are still dominant in higher positions. There are lots of educated role models out there, although boys do tend to gravitate towards male role models in sports and in music and things like that, rather than in education. Teacher interactions, again, we've mentioned teacher interactions with girls. We can talk about negative teacher interactions with boys. The feminisation of education, of course, that works both ways. So the feminisation of education, lots of advantages for girls, some disadvantages for boys. Boys are seen as being more active learners. They like to be more practical, whereas teaching methods may be slightly changed. Boys are expected to do better in high stakes tests. Boys tend to overestimate their own ability, and that means that they tend to perform better in one-off high stakes tests than girls do. Laddish subcultures, and this is a big influence I think on reasons for boys' underachievement, is the fact that education has become feminised. Therefore, boys who do well in education tend to be mocked by other boys. We can also talk about sort of like how with lots of boys underachieving, they become very frustrated with the education system and they act out against it. Lower expectations and false confidence. So teachers may have lower expectations of boys. Boys may have false confidence in themselves. Boys may think that they can pass with minimal effort, whereas girls tend to underestimate their own ability, and therefore they probably work harder. That is another reason that we could use to explain the differences between achievement for males and females. Let's look at the question. Again, we've got to pick out things from the item that we can use. So it says, in recent years, girls have been outperforming their male peers at all stages of the education system. This has been explained by sociologists as being due to the changes in the way women are taught and assessed. We could pick up something there, as well as the increased presence of women in educational roles. So hopefully after we've gone through those other two slides, you can see quite a few things that we could pick out that we can mention in this response. These are the ones I picked out. Taught and assessed, that leads to things like feminisation of education, changes to assessment, as well as increased presence of women in educational roles, lack of male role models, female role models. We can also talk about taught and assessed and sort of like throw in teacher interactions in there as well. Let's look at my response. Okay, so the question is, apply material from item A, analyse 2 ways in which in-school factors impact on gender differences in educational achievement. Okay, so I start these sentences out by linking back to the item, making sure I explicitly reference the item. Again, it's signposting to an examiner that you're doing what the question is asking you to do. One way in which in-school factors impact on gender differences in achievement is through the increased presence of women in educational roles, item A. This serves 2 different functions. So you can see here, I'm going to do a kind of compare and contrast analysis here. As more female teachers leads girls to see more educated role models, and this increases their aspirations to work harder, achieve higher, and go on to emulate their teachers. So I've put forward one argument and how this boosts girls' achievement. And now I put forward the other argument, which says that it has a negative impact on boys' achievement. Secondly, with more females in education, boys have less male role models that are educated to be inspired by. As a consequence, boys look to other areas of society, such as sports and music, for role models, and they perceive education to be a feminine domain. As a result, they are less motivated to achieve in academic subjects and are more focused on goals in other walks of life, such as sport. And again, we can put a little criticism in here. Critics would suggest that the gender of a role model is of less importance than the message they put across. We could expand on this a little bit and sort of like say that many girls have male role models and that many boys can have female role models, and that in our society we should really judge role models for what they contribute to society rather than sort of like their gender. But that's our first paragraph. Second paragraph, a second way in which in-school factors might impact on gender differences in achievement is through changes in the way children are taught and assessed. Again, item A, this refers to changes in the curriculum following the introduction of the Education Reform Act in 1988, which introduced GCSEs in coursework as well as the national curriculum. So I'm using a bit of policy here. Even though policy is on a different spec point, we can use policy to explain gender differences. Mitsos and Brown, bit of research, found that the introduction of coursework has increased the achievement of girls, as this is better suited to their skill set of being more conscientious about their work. And again, use that compare and contrast. In comparison, boys were thought to do better in high stakes tests, which explains why girls started to achieve better grades with the introduction of coursework as an element of the final grade. Right, now here's our however. A little bit of an evaluation here. Despite changes to the curriculum in 2015, which removed coursework from many subjects, girls' achievement remains higher than boys, although the introduction of linear exams has slightly improved boys' achievement. Now, this is the case across the board. No matter what social class you belong to, or no matter what ethnic group you belong to, girls do better than boys. That's the 2022 challenge for today, day 3. We've now done 9 out of the 125 questions that I'm going to ask. Moving on to day 4. Day 4, we're going to look at ethnicity in education. There's 3 questions I've set here again. 1, outline and explain 2 ways that education can be seen as ethnocentric. Okay, so that's a good one to look at. 2, outline and explain 3 ways in which out-of-school factors impact on the achievement of different ethnic groups. So out-of-school factors, you're looking at cultural explanations, material explanations, you're looking at things like racism in wider society. Question 3, apply material from item A, analyse 2 ways in which in-school factors influence ethnic differences in the experience of education. Now, experience has come up a couple of times on the exam. Experience can be things like self-esteem, feeling like they belong. It can be achievement, but you have to mention how it has involved their experience. So things like bullying can have an impact on your experience. Feeling like you are represented within the curriculum has an impact on your experience. Students feeling alienated by the policies and processes that go on within schools can be part of their experience. In the item here, I've put, there are broad trends in educational achievement across ethnic groups. Some sociologists suggest that the reason for these differences is due to the interactions that pupils have with their teachers and their peers. So we may look at teachers, we may look at peer groups. Others suggest that differences in achievement are down to the organisation of the education system itself, which kind of hints at things like institutional racism, ethnocentrism within the curriculum. That is day 3. This is day 4's questions. You'll be able to download the print version of my answers with some of the spelling mistakes that I've noticed as we've been going through this taken out from the website, roughly around about 10-15 minutes after the video has gone live. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your exams.